Mr. President, I rise yet again today to speak about an issue near and dear to my heart and an issue that has become the focus of many of my passions here in the United States Senate. That is about the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. This is an important and overwhelmingly bipartisan piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that passed the House in July by an overwhelming vote of 365 to 65. Two of these things should strike the American people as remarkable. One, that something with that much of a bipartisan margin passed in the House of Representatives. Number two, that it deals with immigration. And it was still that overwhelming and that bipartisan. As I've explained in this chamber before, the concept of this legislation is simple. Our current method for allocating green cards caps the total number of green cards that nationals of any one country may receive. In practice, this results in severe de facto discrimination on the basis of country of origin. You see, because immigrants from countries with large populations are restricted to receiving the same number of visas as immigrants from smaller countries, their wait times have ballooned, in some cases stretching out literally for decades. The problem compounds over time, and it becomes even more unfair than it was many decades ago when this was first enacted into law. And I repeat, this happens for absolutely no reason other than the country in which the immigrant was born. So let's say that two immigrants, one from India and the other from Germany, with the exact same skills, the exact same degrees, and the exact same job experience, apply at the same hour of the same day for an employment-based green card. The German might wait maybe 12 months to receive a green card, while the Indian applicant will almost certainly wait a decade or far more. This kind of system is antithetical to American values and to the interest our country has in recruiting the very best and the very brightest from around the world, irrespective of race, of religion, or country of origin. It is simply unacceptable that in 2019, our immigration system still contains country of origin discrimination as a defining feature. The per-country caps, Mr. President, simply must go. They're wrong. They were never good policy. Whatever policy they might have had in mind decades ago, it escapes me, except, in fact, that the policy itself was at the outset wrong. And it has become more wrong over time as these problems have compounded. The obviousness of the moral error embedded within this legislation is more profound and easily visible today than it ever has been. If you were to describe this to anyone, they'd scratch their head and say, why would you want to do that? Unless you're engaging in some type of discrimination that we, as a country, understandably have abandoned a long time ago and should no longer embrace. Now, the harm inflicted by any kind of invidious discrimination, whether on the basis of race or sex or country of origin, does not simply exist in the abstract, in the ether. The human suffering caused by it happens to be real and heartbreaking. Although, in the time that we have here this afternoon to discuss this, I'm sure I can't come anywhere close to doing justice to all the people who are being harmed by the per-country cap system. I'd like to share at least a few of their stories so that you understand how this law operates. I find that when you tell stories about a law, people understand the law and they understand what needs to change about the law a lot more than they would have otherwise. Ugna-Hin Chu. Ugna-Hin Gu is a registered nurse who lives in South Jordan, Utah, currently working at a nonprofit healthcare organization in Utah. She received her bachelor's degree in this country. She's lived in this country for the past 10 years. Languishing in the decades-long backlog, she's now being forced to consider leaving the United States due to the continuous uncertainty of her immigration status and the incessant renewals of temporary visas. If she leaves, she'll take her talents and her training with her, depriving Utah's residents of a smart, skilled, kind, and caring nurse. Ashish Patel first came to Utah legally in 2005 on a temporary high-skilled work visa. Since that time, he's worked hard at his job, he's paid taxes, followed the law, he got married, had 2 kids, both of whom were born as American citizens. In February of 2011, Mr. Patel's petition to earn a green card was approved. Despite this, and despite the fact that 8 going on 9 years have now elapsed, his green card remains unissued. Why? Well, solely because of the arbitrary, wrong, discriminatory per-country caps. Ashish Patel is still in the backlog, even as immigrants from other countries who applied years and years after he did, and years after he received his approval, have already been granted permanent resident status. If Mr. Patel had immigrated from any country in the world other than India, he would already have had his green card today. Dr. Chaitanya Mumilapuli is an endocrinologist who's been serving in Central Illinois for the past 9 years. He came to the United States in 2007. He will likely not receive his green card for at least another decade. His daughter was 1 year old when she came with her parents to this country. In a few years, she will age out of her temporary visa, and Dr. Mumilapuli will face a decision that confronts many people stuck in the backlog community. Does he separate from his daughter as she loses her temporary status? Or does he abandon his life in the U.S. in order to keep his family together? Dr. Priya Shanmugnam lives in Louisiana and is an aerospace engineer who studied at the University of Alabama and at UCLA. She dreams of working for NASA. After 13 years in the backlog, she's still waiting for a green card. As a result of that, she cannot fulfill her dream of joining America's space team and helping put the first person on Mars. Until she finally gets her green card, our country will continue to lose out on her talent. Dr. Krishnendu Roy is a professor of computer science and the head of the Department of Computer Science at Valdosta State University in Georgia. He studied for his degree in Louisiana and has lived in the United States for over 16 years. During that time, he's shaped the lives of countless students in Georgia through the classes he teaches, by organizing computing camps for K through 12 students, and by mentoring the robotics team in his community. He's followed the law, and he's done exactly what's required of him under our immigration system in order to earn his green card. And yet he remains stuck in the backlog with no end to his wait in sight. Dr. Sri Obularity is an oncologist working just outside Dickinson, North Dakota, who came to the United States in 2006. She moved to North Dakota because the area has experienced a shortage of specialized physicians. Her impact on the community has been invaluable. Recently, she tried to return from a trip to India, but approval for her visa was delayed for 6 weeks, forcing her patients to travel as far as 100 miles as they scrambled to find a temporary physician. The pain this caused her patients would never have come about if she hadn't been subjected to an arbitrary cap, an arbitrary discriminatory cap based on her country of origin, and had already received her green card. Ash Coonan lives in Oklahoma. Her story is a heartbreaking example of the devastating effects of the long wait for a green card and the effects that a family can endure under this system. Ash and his wife lost their toddler son to a congenital disease about 3 years ago. The illness that took their son could have been treated had they been able to move to a different home, one closer to the medical facility that provided the needed treatment. But they were unable to do so, and their son was thus unable to receive the care he required, he needed, because Ash was forced to remain with the same employer while he waited in the green card backlog and consequently was unable to move. These are just some of the names and some of the stories of some of the people, the hardworking, law-abiding immigrants who have come to the United States to build a life and contribute to our communities, but who have been told that because of the country in which they were born, they have to wait decades in the green card backlog before they can start living the American dream. These stories stir us to action, and they darn well should. They should remind us that while policymaking is often messy and complicated, it's sometimes simple and straightforward, because sometimes you stumble across something that's a good idea. Sometimes you stumble across something that was a bad idea that was put into law decades ago and should be taken out of the law. Sometimes the solution to our problems is clear and beyond question. In those cases, all we need is the will to act. I have yet to hear someone offer a reasoned defense of the per-country caps as meritorious or sound public policy on their own terms. And that's because there is no such defense. At least not one that anyone would be willing to defend in public. Country of origin discrimination, whether it be in our immigration system, in our justice system, in the employment context, or in housing, is wrong, and it's inconsistent with the values upon which our country was founded. It becomes even more repugnant when its human consequences are as obvious and tragic and focused on people of a particular country of origin as they are here. What if, Mr. President, there had been something in place with respect to the ancestors of people now serving in this body, arbitrarily, unfairly discriminating against people from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Denmark, other countries where people have been immigrating to America for centuries? We should think about that for a moment and think about how we would never have been able to enjoy the blessings of America. I think it's equally wrong for us to identify a single country that we punish, that we exclude, uniquely against other countries of origin in the context of employment-based immigrant visas. Now, I understand and recognize that while the per-country caps themselves are completely indefensible, and they are, some people have concerns about how eliminating the caps might impact fraud and abuse within the H-1B system. That's a legitimate concern. And to address those very concerns, in this Congress, I've negotiated an amendment to the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act with Senator Grassley to include some new protections for American workers in how we process applications for H-1B visas. The amendment does three things. First, the Grassley Amendment would strengthen the Department of Labor's ability to investigate and enforce labor condition application requirements. In addition, it reforms the labor condition application process to ensure complete and adequate disclosure of information regarding the employer's H-1B hiring practices. And finally, it closes off loopholes by which employers could otherwise circumvent the annual cap on H-1B workers. These are important and worthy reforms, reforms that I was happy to add to the bill. Indeed, we saw an example just last month of the positive impact these reforms would have. In September, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement announced a $2.5 million settlement with an Indian consulting firm for H-1B visa fraud. That firm was exploiting the so-called B-1 in lieu of H-1B loophole. One of the new provisions we added to the bill this Congress would help close that specific loophole. Importantly, the Grassley Amendment, like the underlying bill, consists of provisions that have long enjoyed support from members of both sides of the aisle. They're drawn primarily from an H-1B reform bill that has been championed by both Senator Grassley and Senator Durbin. They're also modeled in large part on an amendment to the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act that Senator Schumer negotiated with Senator Grassley in a previous Congress. I'm grateful that Senator Grassley was willing to come to the table and work with me and others in good faith on a reasonable compromise to this bill. I believe the deal we struck is a fair and even-handed way to address long-standing concerns about our H-1B system, while eliminating country of origin discrimination in how we allocate skills-based green cards. I've said, as I've said in the past, Mr. President, there's no question that immigration is one of the most politically fraught issues in Congress right now, if not the single most politically fraught issue. That makes it all the more important for us at least to come together to get something done in those areas where we can find common ground. It's a little bit like eating an elephant. You can't swallow the whole thing at once, either the elephant or the donkey. You got to do it one bite at a time. And why not start with an area where there is broad-based bipartisan agreement? That's what this bill is. The Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act is an important step toward common ground. Unquestionably, there are broader debates on immigration policy being had in Congress and across the country right now. Some wish to reform our immigration system by increasing the number of green cards we issue, while others wish to move to a more merit-based system. That debate is almost certainly not going to be resolved this day, today, or this month, or this year, or perhaps even during this Congress. Notably, however, many senators on both sides of that debate, ardent champions of both liberal and conservative immigration reforms, who ordinarily could not be farther apart when it comes to immigration policy, are co-sponsors of the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. The reason why this is the case is that they recognize that regardless of what else we might do to reform our immigration system, country of origin discrimination is outdated, outmoded, immoral, morally indefensible, and inconsistent with our values, and it's a problem that we can solve right now. The other reason the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act has been so successful in attracting support from both sides of the aisle, from every end along the political continuum, is because we've scrupulously avoided the typical poison pill provisions that so often doom attempts at immigration reform. We've also quite carefully avoided this becoming about so many things that it's going to become controversial no matter what. This bill is not comprehensive immigration reform. It's not anything close to that. And that is, in fact, why this bill is something that we can get done right now. It's the reason why it was able to pass the House of Representatives with 365 votes. While it does not fix many of the other flaws that plague other components of our broken, outdated, outmoded Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly era immigration law system, it is a great and important step toward reform. If we're ever going to have a chance at modernizing and repairing our immigration laws, we need to recognize that we cannot necessarily solve all of our problems at once. The fact that this is the case should not stand in our way of starting the work the American people sent us here to do.